What would Martin Luther King say if he saw what they did to Marcus Rashford? He wouldn't ask for calm, he wouldn't stay neutral, and he certainly wouldn't accept you calling it a social media mistake or fan overreaction, because Martin Luther King was never afraid to point out what needs to be said, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it hurts, even if it goes against the majority. If he were watching that Euro Cup final where Rashford, Saka and Sancho missed their penalties, he wouldn't be looking at the ball. He'd be looking into the eyes of the people around him, and he'd realize what many people try to pretend they didn't see, that it wasn't just a sporting error, it was a racial judgment on national television. It was a silent sentence. It was that old poison dripping again, the same poison he spent his life trying to cure. Do you realize this? Do you realize how quickly, aggressively, inhumanely the reaction came? It was minutes between the kick and the avalanche of racism, between the mistake and the monkey emojis, between the silence and the hatred. Do you think if they had lighter skin, the weight would be the same? Do you really think that fury would have the same color? Martin Luther King would have no doubt. He would have said, as he already did, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And you who may have seen that and thought overreaction, or who stayed quiet, or who thought it wasn't your problem, you're also part of it, because silence often screams louder than words of hate. It's the silence of the good that fuels the courage of the bad. And when Rashford saw all that fall on him, the attacks, the insults, the judgments, he could have hidden, he could have stayed silent, but that's not what he did. He stood tall. He looked the world back in the eye and said, I will never apologize for who I am and where I come from. Martin Luther King would call that dignity, and dignity isn't given. Dignity is built, sometimes with pain, sometimes with shame, sometimes with blood. And when a black man is attacked for being black and still stands up, he's not just responding for himself. He's standing up for entire generations who were taught to lower their heads. And then came the mural with Rashford's face, defaced with racist phrases. They scratched his image as if they could erase what he represents, as if hateful paint could cover the struggle of someone who carries history on their back. But they couldn't, because on that same wall where they tried to spew racism came children, mothers, neighbors, ordinary people, and they covered everything with notes of support, flowers, words written with trembling pens. And Martin Luther King, if he saw that, would know there is still light, there is still resistance, there is still hope, because that's how you fight darkness, not by returning hate, but by igniting more light. Do you realize how this simple gesture, a child's drawing, a paper glued to the wall, is worth more than 1,000 speeches? Do you realize what's at stake when it comes to racism? It's not just opinion. It's not just politics. It's the soul of a society that insists on dehumanizing black bodies as if they were disposable, wrong, suspicious. And Rashford didn't stop there. He could have gone back to the field, focused on football, left it behind. But no, he remembered where he came from when his mother would stop eating so that he would have something to take in his lunchbox, from when he was just another black child in a forgotten neighborhood trying to exist. And he used his voice. He spoke for those who couldn't. He fought for school meals. He confronted the government. He won the Order of the British Empire. But that's just what's in the newspaper. What's not in the newspaper is what King always saw, the invisible impact. The child who looks at Rashford and understands that they can exist. The black boy who holds his head high at school because he saw someone who looks like him being respected. That's what King called true transformation, and that's what you can't ignore. Can you understand why skin color is still a target? Can you look beyond what they show in the comments and see the structure that supports all of this? Or will you continue to think it's whining, that it's an overreaction, that this is already in the past? Martin Luther King, if he were here, would look you in the eye and ask, how long are you going to wait to do something? How long are you going to call an overreaction what is just old pain repeated once again? Because he knew, more than anyone, that racism doesn't need applause, it just needs people who see it and do nothing. So when Rashford missed that penalty, it wasn't just the ball that didn't go in, it was the wound that opened again, it was the alert that sounded again, and it was also a chance to look at this with seriousness, with shame, with truth. And you? What are you going to do with this chance? King wouldn't have waited for the next final, or the next case, or the next black person assaulted. He would have spoken now, as he always spoke. And the truth is that the world has tried to swallow Marcus Rashford, as it has tried before with so many others, as it tries every day with those born with dark skin and a name outside the standard. And what Martin Luther King Jr. would see in this is not an isolated case, it's not an exception. He would see a pattern that repeats itself, that hides, that changes shape, but never disappears. Can you imagine what it's like to grow up being taught that to err is human, but to discover that if you're black, the mistake costs more, that the failure becomes a sentence, that the stumble becomes a reason to question your place. Marcus kicked that ball with the weight of an entire country on his back, but he also kicked it with something even crueler, the silent warning that if he failed, it wouldn't just be a player making a mistake, it would be a black person making a mistake, and that, for many, is unacceptable. Martin Luther King was already talking about this when he shouted to the four winds that the problem is not only in the racist who assaults, it's in the system that allows it. It's in the structure that normalizes it. It's in the culture that trivializes it. It's in the people who silence. And you? What do you do when you see this happen? Do you react? Does it bother you? Or do you keep playing the game? Because the game, this game that we watch, that we cheer for, that we idolize, it also has an owner. And when the one who makes a mistake is white, the mistake becomes a narrative of overcoming. But when the one who makes a mistake is black, the mistake becomes identity. It becomes stigma. It becomes offense. It becomes a defaced mural. It becomes a threat. And even so, Rashford didn't return the hate. He didn't arm himself with fury. He didn't point the finger. He simply said, "I will not apologize for who I am." That's courage. That's awareness. That's what Martin Luther King called strength of soul. Do you understand the difference between reacting with pain and responding with dignity? Have you ever felt this kind of pain? The one that doesn't scream but weighs down, that doesn't bleed but suffocates, that doesn't appear on the skin but marks the memory. Rashford felt it, and he transformed it into attitude, into concrete action, into real change. When he went after the government to guarantee food for the children of the periphery, he wasn't doing charity. He was doing justice, because he knew that hunger and racism go together, that inequality and skin color are not a coincidence. And Martin Luther King, if he were watching that, would know that there was something bigger than a campaign there. There was redemption, there was response, there was revolution, and what did society do with that? It gave a medal, and then went back to offend. The same society that applauds the conquest stones the error. The same hand that extends, pushes, the same mouth that praises, wounds. And that's why King said, freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Rashford didn't ask permission to exist. He demanded respect for the simple fact of existing, and that's a threat to those who want to maintain the unjust order of things. Because when a black person refuses to lower their head, they don't just challenge prejudice, they challenge silence, they force the world to look at itself in the mirror. And the world doesn't like what it sees. Have you looked at that mirror for real, or do you still pretend it's not your problem? Do you still use the word whining when you hear someone say that they were treated as suspicious, as strange, as wrong, just for being black? Martin Luther King never tired of repeating, nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. You can't say you didn't know anymore. You can't hide behind, but not everyone thinks that way. Because what's happening isn't about thinking, it's about feeling. It's about seeing a mural being destroyed with hatred and deciding what you're going to do with that. Are you going to walk past? Are you going to stay in the stands? Are you going to pretend it has nothing to do with you? Or are you going to come down to the field of life and do something? Marcus Rashford did. Without a microphone, without a platform, without a prepared speech. He just said that he wasn't ashamed of his origin, and that was enough to lift up people who had long felt invisible. To give courage to those who only knew how to swallow their tears. To show that making a mistake doesn't dehumanize you. What dehumanizes you is being reduced to that mistake because of the color of your skin. Do you realize the depth of this? Do you understand that racism doesn't always scream? Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it just makes its presence felt in the look, in the way a news story is written, in the tone used to judge a gesture, in the silence that comes when someone is attacked. And it's in this silence that Martin Luther King was most disturbed. He knew that blatant hatred can even be faced with firmness, but silence is more treacherous because it wears the clothing of neutrality. It disguises itself as, I have nothing to do with it, but it fuels the system. It allows the cycle to continue, and when the silence is from the majority, injustice becomes the norm. Are you silent? Because when Rashford was attacked, he wasn't alone. That was a cruel reminder that skin color still defines how the world sees you, but it was also an invitation for those who see, for those who feel, for those who care, to stand up. Have you ever wondered how many times a black person needs to prove that they deserve to be where they are? Have you thought about how suffocating it is to live knowing that even if you succeed, there will be people ready to reduce everything to what you represent and not to what you are? Because if you've never stopped to think about that, maybe now is the time. Because the problem isn't out there. It's here, it's close, it's when someone silences. It's when someone watches and moves on. It's when the pain of another becomes just another news story that you forget the next day. You saw what they did to Marcus Rashford. You saw what he responded. And maybe you thought it was beautiful. Maybe you were moved. Maybe you thought it shows how much the world still needs to change. But then I ask you and you, What have you been doing with that? Because indignation without action is just spectacle. It's just empty applause. It doesn't transform anything. And if Martin Luther King were here, he wouldn't be satisfied with your emotion. He would want to know what your place is in all of this. What is your stance when you see racism rear its head? Even if disguised, even if subtle. What do you say when someone makes a cutting comment? When someone justifies violence? When someone blames the victim? Do you have courage? Or do you prefer comfort? It's no use saying you're against racism and continuing to fuel the silences that allow it to grow. It's no use calling yourself an ally and continuing to ignore those who are begging for space. Because while you're thinking about whether or not to get involved, people are losing their peace, their jobs, their mental health, their lives, just for existing. And the truth is that no one can take it anymore. No one can take being read as a threat just for walking down the street. No one can take being watched inside a store, discredited in an interview, excluded from a conversation circle. No one can take having to repeat every day that their life matters. Have you ever stopped to listen to these voices? Have you let them cross you without running away from the discomfort? Marcus Rashford didn't shut up, even being cursed, defaced, attacked. He had every reason in the world to lower his head, and he didn't, because he understood that it couldn't just be about him. It was about what he represented, and he represented you. He represented every black child who grows up hearing that they need to be twice as good to get half as much. He represented those who never had the chance to make a mistake in peace. He represented those who live in fear and keep going anyway. And now, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to continue as if nothing happened? Are you going to treat it as just another inspiring story that passes through your timeline and disappears 2 minutes later? Or are you going to allow it to transform you, to push you out of the bubble, to make you get up from the bench and enter the game of real life? Because that's where the fight begins. It's not in the speech. It's not in the support emoji, it's in the discomfort. It's when you hear something wrong and decide that you're not going to let it pass anymore. It's when you understand that racism isn't just a problem for those who suffer, it's a problem for those who allow it. And to allow it is to not act. So I ask you again, with everything you've heard, that you've seen, that you've felt, what are you going to do? If this has ever happened to you, comment, "I needed to hear this." If you feel that this makes sense, leave a yes in the comments. And if this touched you for real, share it with someone who needs to hear this too. Because silence has never been an option, never has been, and now more than ever it can't be.